Good afternoon. My research interests are in cybercrime and in particular the investigation and enforcement of cybercrime. This webinar is designed as an introduction to some of the issues surrounding the international enforcement of cybercrime. So we will look at some of the problems surrounding the enforcement of cybercrime generally, then move on to talking about the international aspects of cybercrime, international instruments designed to facilitate the enforcement of cybercrime, some of the international organisations involved in facilitating the enforcement of cybercrime, and then we'll have the Q&A. In studying cybercrime, one thing I find perplexing is society's approach to cybercrime as against other crimes. I saw this cartoon recently and it struck me as being particularly apt. Perhaps it captures my concern in relation to society's approach to cybercrime, because the main way we protect ourselves from cybercrime is by building walls, albeit virtual walls, but we build walls around us. And by virtual walls, I mean cybersecurity measures, protecting who can get us near us virtually through cybersecurity systems filtering out our emails to stop things such as junk, spam and phishing. Our virtual life is a bit like living in the Middle Ages. We have to retreat behind our virtual walls surrounded by our cybersecurity moat and be very careful about who we let in and when we let the drawbridge down. But there are a couple of significant issues with this approach. Firstly, cybersecurity is costly, complex and a bit cumbersome. We struggle with multiple passwords and security measures. Secondly, over time the cyber criminals seem just to get smarter. It becomes a cat and mouse game and they are able to breach our virtual walls. Contrast this with how we protect ourselves from, for want of a better word, normal crime. Unless we live in a country where the rule of law has broken down, we don't rely on high walls and moats. We rely primarily on law enforcement to detect crime, prosecutors and the courts to inflict punishments on offenders that deter them from committing more crime and deter others from committing crime. We don't stop crime altogether, but we can live relatively freely and securely. Wouldn't it be nice if we could wander around our virtual world, conducting business online, making payments online, without having to worry about becoming a victim of cybercrime? Well, why can't we? Why can't we rely on law enforcement to do the same job for cybercrime as they do for other crime? The obvious answer to date has been that it's just too hard for law enforcement to tackle cybercrime. But why is that? Should we not try to better tease out why it is too hard and work at solutions? Some of the issues as to why we have this lack of enforcement is the international nature of the problem. Whereas criminals generally do not respect international borders, for cybercrimes this is normal. In fact, some surveys show that close to 100% of cybercrimes have an international dimension. No other crime can become transnational so effortlessly. One positive thing, I suppose, from a law enforcement perspective is that leaving aside for the moment the difficult issues of privacy and encryption, in cybercrime there is a digital trail showing who actually committed the cybercrime. But at the moment, from a law enforcement perspective, the international nature of the crime presents a significant hurdle, perhaps the most significant hurdle to taking enforcement action against cybercrime and cybercrime criminals. This is because our law enforcement services and criminal justice system emerged over time to effectively deal with local and perhaps national, but not international crime. As such, our law enforcement resources are focused on local and perhaps national crime, as is the training of law enforcement personnel, and here I include police, prosecutors and judges. And I would also suspect that up until fairly recently, this was satisfactory from the public's point of view, in that that was the way they wanted it. That was those sort of crimes that they wanted to be taken seriously and prosecuted. But I think gradually the tide is turning. For example, today a lot more is lost from cyber fraud than other types of fraud. Online child sexual exploitation seems to be becoming almost out of control, Governments themselves are losing a lot of money in ransomware attacks and are increasingly concerned about attacks on critical infrastructure. So we need to make a fundamental shift in our criminal justice system to more effectively tackle international cybercrime. This requires changes in, firstly, our laws, secondly, the structure of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and in particular, facilitating the coordination of law enforcement bodies so they can obtain the evidence needed to prosecute, and thirdly, training and resources. Well, how far are we along this path? We have made some steps, but there is a long way to go. Governments are starting to come to terms with the impact of cybercrime and are starting to commit some significant resources to the problem. At the international level, the most important instrument to fight cybercrime is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. This is an international treaty designed to harmonise laws so that all countries have similar criminal offences. For example, all countries that have signed the convention criminalise unauthorised access to data. It is important to harmonise our laws to eliminate safe havens, to ensure that all jurisdictions criminalise hacking, for example. The Budapest Convention also works to ensure law enforcement has the appropriate powers to investigate cybercrime. For example, countries that have adopted the convention all give their law enforcement the power to order the preservation of data and grant them other powers to be able to gather evidence to be used to prosecute cyber criminals. The convention also is designed to foster international cooperation between law enforcement, to try and get law enforcement to work together to ensure that perpetrators can be prosecuted. The convention was a European initiative, but other countries have been invited to join it. But Europe is still the driving force behind the convention. Like all international treaties, it is not sufficient for a country to just sign the treaty. It actually has to put laws in place which comply with the convention. Canada signed the convention in 2001 and became fully compliant in 2015. From this slide, you can see the reach of the Budapest Convention. As you can see, countries in Canada, US, Europe, and many others have fully adopted the convention, 63 countries in all. But it is by no means universal. One issue with the convention is what it covers. It does cover cybercrimes such as offences against confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of computer data and systems, fraud and forgery, computer-related offences, child pornography, and criminal copyright infringement. But there are some gaps. It does not cover pure identity theft, where there was not an associated fraud. It doesn't cover the significant problem of luring children over the internet, and it doesn't cover spam emails. One other issue is that there is not universal agreement between countries that this should be the main international instrument in dealing with cybercrime. Some countries, in particular Russia and China, think the United Nations should develop its own convention. Russia, for example, says it is concerned about some of the provisions in the convention, and in particular a provision which allows a party to access a computer system in a territory provided it has the consent of the person who has lawful authority to disclose the data. So perhaps it'll enable, if a server was in a country, law enforcement in that country to be able to access data on the server if it gets consent from the server owner, even though the owner of the actual data is in Russia. But in response, the countries who are parties to the convention say it is sufficient and we can't waste time reinventing the wheel. For problems like that identified by Russia, they say that can be resolved, for example, by Russia just opting out of the provision overall. The good news, as you can see from the diagram, is that even though some countries have not signed the convention, they still have laws which are largely compliant with its terms. Although this is the main international instrument in relation to cybercrime, there are other regional conventions. For example, There is the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, the Arab States Convention on Combating Information Technology Offences of 2010, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation's Agreement on the Cooperation in the Field of International Information Security. All are designed, at least in part, to increase cooperation in fighting cybercrime. They show an increased recognition that cybercrime is a problem for all citizens of the world, and we need laws and to be able to effectively work together to tackle the problem. The convention was a European initiative, so in addition to trying to get countries to sign on, the push is also now for capacity building. The Council of Europe has a cybercrime program office in Romania, and it has a number of programs designed to support countries to strengthen their criminal justice capacities to respond to the challenges posed by cybercrime and electronic evidence based on the Budapest Convention of Cybercrime. For example, it has designated 12 hub countries around the world in different regions. For example, in Central America, the hub country is Costa Rica. It is working to build expertise within that particular hub country, such as the capacity of police to investigate cybercrime and cooperate with each other, the capacity to prosecute, etc., which hopefully will then spread to other countries within that region. Moving then to some of the main international organisations involved in fighting cybercrime. INTERPOL and Europol are probably the most important. INTERPOL has a staff of about 1,000 people, most of them on secondment from national law enforcement agencies. It provides investigative support for cybercrime and cybercrime training for law enforcement. It is also increasingly developing partnerships with private organisations as an acknowledgement that data and expertise lies within the private sector. Perhaps most importantly, it works to coordinate law enforcement in tackling cybercrime. Increasingly, it is seeing results from its efforts. Some of its recent successes are international joint law enforcement efforts which have taken down dark web marketplaces and child pornography rings. For example, recently it announced that it had successful enforcement action against some vendors and buyers on the dark web. In this operation, law enforcement from Europe, Canada and the United States worked together to shut down 50 dark web accounts used for illegal activity, made 61 arrests, executed 65 search warrants, seized about 300 kilos of drugs, 51 firearms, 4 million euros in cryptocurrency, 2.2 million euros in cash, and 35,000 euros in gold. Another important international organisation in relation to cybercrime is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This is part of the United Nations, and its focus is on transnational crime, which now takes into account cybercrime, particularly transnational organised crime. It is also working on capacity building amongst member states, as well as conducting analysis of the extent of the problem. We also have the International Governance Forum, an initiative of the United Nations which seeks to be a venue to foster the security and stability of the Internet. Clearly, cybercrime is a real problem for the security and the stability of the Internet. So it is working with agreements between governments and tech companies to stop malicious activities. There is also the International Telecommunication Union. This is a UN specialised agency for information and communication technologies. This takes into account cybercrime, and it is also working on capacity building in providing countries with the knowledge, expertise and tools to fight cybercrime. This webinar was designed to be a brief outline of some of the main instruments and organisations involved in fighting cybercrime. Because of the international nature of cybercrime, effective enforcement must include changes in our laws so there are no safe havens and so law enforcement have the tools they need. Efficient and effective coordination between international law enforcement agencies so they can quickly and relatively easily obtain the evidence they need to prosecute. And importantly, a shift in training of law enforcement and an increase in resources dedicated to tackling the problem from governments. Some progress has been made, but much more is needed before the threat of prosecution acts as a sufficient deterrent for those considering engaging in cybercrime. Thank you. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions.